What if the Cold War ended before it even got properly frosty? Picture this: Neil Armstrong and a Soviet cosmonaut sharing a borscht MRE on the moon in 1975. Imagine the internet being a niche government project that never really took off, leaving your pocket feeling strangely empty. And get this? The biggest threat to global peace in the 1980s wasn't nukes, but a massive coordinated effort to stop the Sahara Desert from expanding, involving American bulldozers and Russian irrigation experts working side by side. In a world where President John F. Kennedy survived that fateful day in Dallas, and against all odds, managed to broker a lasting peace with the Soviet Union in the mid-1960s, the ripple effects changed everything. Absolutely everything. Number 10. The moon landing almost got cancelled for a giant Earth party. It sounds wild, but the race to the moon, that iconic symbol of Cold War rivalry, nearly got ditched after Kennedy and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, who in this timeline rose to prominence earlier and was more receptive to Kennedy's overtures following a less severe Cuban Missile Crisis, signed the historic Global Peace and Cooperate Accord in 1966. The whole world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Kennedy famously had once suggested a joint US-Soviet moon mission. With peace breaking out, this wasn't just a suggestion anymore. It became official policy. The Apollo-Soyuz Unity Mission was slated for 1975, a grand symbol of former foes reaching for the stars together. Astronauts and cosmonauts began cross-training, learning each other's languages, and even developing a taste for each other's space food. But then, something unexpected happened. A huge global movement fueled by scientists, activists, and everyday people started asking, why the moon when we have problems right here? The argument was powerful. Billions were being poured into rockets and lunar modules. What if that same money, that same incredible brain power, was focused on Earth? Think eradicating diseases, turning deserts green, cleaning the oceans. The idea of a giant Earth party, a global festival of cooperation tackling terrestrial challenges, caught fire. Television debates raged not about communism versus capitalism, but about moon rocks versus clean water for all. Kennedy, ever the pragmatist, and keen to ride the wave of this new global optimism, listened. He didn't entirely scrap the moonshot. That would be too much of a climb down. The Apollo-Soyuz Unity Mission did happen in 1975. There were handshakes in orbit, a joint flag planted on the lunar surface, a specially designed one featuring a dove and olive branch intertwined with Earth, and polite speeches. The fanfare was mute. It felt more like a historical obligation than a bold leap into the future. The real excitement, the real funding was already shifting. The Global Rejuvenation Fund, established by the UN with massive contributions from the US and USSR, became the new darling. Sen, its first macabre. The Sahara Greening Initiative, decades-long effort that saw American and Soviet engineers working shoulder to shoulder to lay vast irrigation networks. Astronauts, once heroes of the final frontier, found themselves giving lectures at school, fundraisers for water pumps in Africa. Space exploration didn't die, but it went into a long, quiet hibernation. Manned missions beyond Earth orbit became a distant dream, something dusty old folks talked about from the era of competition. The focus was firmly on terra firma, for better or worse. Number 9. Your sci-fi might still be a sci-fi dream. That sleek device in your pocket connecting you to a world of information and cat videos might still be confined to the pages of pulp science fiction novels if Kennedy had ended the Cold War early. So much of the tech we take for granted, the internet, GPS, even the rapid miniaturization of microchips got a supercharged boost from Cold War military spending. Pentagon wanted secure communication networks. Hello, ARPANET, the internet's grandpa. Pinpoint navigation for missiles leading to GPS, and ever smaller, faster computers for weapons systems. With a peace treaty signed in the mid-60s, the massive military-industrial complex began a slow, somewhat reluctant downsizing. The peace dividend was real, but it meant R&D priorities shifted dramatically. ARPANET, in this world, remained a small, closed network for academics to share research papers on things like advanced crop rotation or fish migration patterns. There was no urgent push to expand it, to make it robust enough to survive a nuclear attack that was no longer an imminent threat. The development of microchips continued, of course, but at a more leisurely pace, driven by civilian consumer goods rather than the relentless demands of military supremacy. Think better toasters, more reliable televisions, and perhaps advanced hearing aids, not supercomputers in every home. The personal computing revolution, which in our timeline exploded in the late 70s and 80s, was a much slower burn. Without the groundwork laid by military-funded research into networking and miniaturization, home computers in the 1980s were clunky, expensive, and mostly used by hobbyists for very specific tasks like cataloging stamp collections. The idea of a worldwide web of interconnected personal devices just didn't have the same impetus. Instead, information dissemination remained largely in the hands of traditional media. Libraries became even more vital community hubs, and the big innovation in home communication by the early 1990s was the widespread adoption of Teletext Plus, an advanced version of the old broadcast text service, offering news, weather, and even basic games through your TV, but it was strictly a one-way street. The digital world as we know it simply took a different, much slower, and less interconnected path. You'd probably still be using phone books and writing a lot more letters. Number 8. Europe accidentally became a superpower while America napped. It's a strange thought, but with the Cold War over America, under some of Kennedy's less globally minded successors in the 1970s, kind of took a victory lap and then decided to focus on domestic bliss. The mantra became peace and prosperity at home. NATO, its primary purpose of deterring Soviet aggression now moot, the USSR itself was undergoing peaceful reforms and demilitarization, gradually lost its teeth. Why maintain huge overseas garrisons when the main threat had evaporated? American troops came home in large numbers. This left Europe in a bit of a pickle, but also with a huge opportunity. For decades, European nations had sheltered under the American nuclear umbrella, their foreign policies often aligned with Washington's. Suddenly, they had to stand on their own 2 feet. The reformed Soviet Union, while no longer an enemy, was still a very large and different neighbor. Individual European countries realized they were too small to navigate this new world order alone. Push for European integration, which had been a slow, bureaucratic process, suddenly got a shot of adrenaline. Fear, or at least a healthy dose of caution, can be a great unifier. By 1978, the Treaty of Brussels was signed, establishing the European Federation, EF, a much tighter political and economic union than the EEC of our timeline. It had a common foreign policy, a unified defense force, smaller than NATO's peak, but highly efficient and technologically advanced, focusing on rapid deployment for regional peacekeeping, and by 1985, a common currency, the euro franc. France and Germany, the traditional engines, found new common purpose. The UK, after much debate, joined as a founding member, seeing it as the only way to maintain influence. The EF rapidly became a third major bloc in global affairs, sometimes siding with the US, sometimes with the reformed Soviet Commonwealth of Sovereign States, as it came to be known, but always asserting its own distinct interests. They poured resources into high-speed rail connecting the continent, led the world in certain green technologies spurred by early climate warnings, and their diplomats became key power brokers in resolving regional tiffs that the US, in its more inward-looking phase, preferred to ignore. It wasn't an aggressive superpower, but a quietly confident one, built on cooperation and a shared desire not to be anyone's junior partner ever again. Number 7. The biggest political enemy in America became traffic jams. Imagine a United States where the defining political battles weren't about foreign ideologies or global threats, but about how long it took to get to work. With the Cold War's end in the mid-60s, the great bogeyman of communism faded from American political discourse. The intense, often paranoid focus on rooting out Reds under the bed dissipated. For a while, there was a sense of national unity, a collective exhale. Peace dividend was channeled into domestic programs. Infrastructure renewal, education, and healthcare initiatives that Kennedy championed in his fictional second and even a controversial third term, allowed by a wave of post-peace popularity. But as the decades wore on, and the memory of existential conflict faded, new fault lines emerged. Without an external enemy to unite against, Americans turned their attention inward and their frustrations focused on more mundane but deeply felt quality of life issues. Post-war suburban dream, supercharged by decades of peace and prosperity, led to sprawling cities, endless highways, and inevitably soul-crushing traffic. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Great American Traffic Jam became a national obsession. News magazines ran cover stories on it. New political movements like the Clear Roads Now Party and the more radical and the Car Brigade gained surprising traction in local and even state elections. Environmental concerns, no longer overshadowed by nuclear annihilation anxiety, also came to the fore. Smog polluted rivers, despite earlier cleanup efforts. And the disappearing countryside became hot-button issues. The old Republican vs. Democrat dynamic shift. You saw new alliances, urbanites and environmentalists versus suburban commuters and developers. National elections were swayed not by foreign policy prowess, but by candidates promising innovative public transport solutions or vowing to make walkable cities great. It wasn't that life was bad. In many ways, it was more comfortable and secure than ever. The grand national purpose that the Cold War, and before it, World War II, had provided was gone. Finding a new one in the quiet hum of peaceful prosperity proved surprisingly difficult, and sometimes the loudest complaints were about the things that made that prosperity a little too congested. Number 6. Russia never had that epic 90s garage sale of tanks. Chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union in our timeline, with its fire sale, privatization, rise of oligarchs, and economic shock therapy, simply didn't happen. In this alternate 1960s, President Kennedy, alongside a more pragmatic Soviet leadership under a figure like Sisygin, perhaps sidelining hardliners after a less confrontational Cuban outcome, embarked on a path of gradual negotiated de-escalation and internal reform for the USSR. The Global Peace and Cooperate Accord included provisions for mutual, verifiable arms reductions and, crucially, extensive economic and technological exchange programs. The Soviet system didn't just vanish overnight. Instead, it began a slow, managed transformation throughout the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Think perestroika and glasnost, but starting much earlier, less chaotically, and with significant Western technical and even financial assistance. channeled through neutral international bodies to avoid perceptions of buying out the East. The Communist Party gradually loosened its grip, allowing for multi-candidate, though initially not multi-party, elections within a socialist framework. State-owned enterprises weren't just flogged off to the highest bidder. Many were reformed into worker cooperatives or more efficient, market-responsive state corporations. The focus was on stability and avoiding social upheaval. As a result, the entity that was once the USSR evolved into something like the Eurasian Commonwealth of Sovereign Republics by the early 1990s, a looser confederation of states, many with socio-demonic ties. There was no mass unemployment, no hyperinflation, no generals selling off military hardware on the black market to make ends meet. Their military was significantly smaller, reoriented towards territorial defense and participation in UN peacekeeping missions, often alongside American troops. One unexpected outcome of the Kennedy-era agricultural exchange programs was that parts of Russia and Ukraine, using advanced American farming techniques and equipment adapted for their climates, became major global exporters of organic grains and produce by the 1980s. Transition wasn't without its bumps, and internal debates about the pace and direction of change were constant. But it avoided the societal trauma and dueling instability that marked the end of the Cold War in our history. They just reformed, quietly and methodically. Number 5. Your favorite made in China gadget might not exist. The famous Nixon goes to China moment in 1972 was a masterful piece of Cold War geostrategy playing the China card against the Soviet Union. But if Kennedy had already negotiated a lasting peace with the Soviets by, say, 1966, the strategic imperative for such a dramatic opening to Mao's China would have been vastly diminished. US-China relations, frozen since the Korean War, would likely have thawed, but at a much slower, more cautious pace. There wouldn't have been that urgent, guilty need to overlook vast ideological differences. Without that Nixonian shock, China, under Mao and his immediate successors, might have remained internally focused for much longer, pursuing its own distinct path of development without significant Western engagement or investment. Cultural revolution might have taken a different course, or lasted longer without the prospect of an American rapprochement, altering internal power dynamics. The shift towards market-oriented reforms, spearheaded by Deng looping in our timeline, could have been delayed by a decade or more, or taken a completely different, less export-driven form. Perhaps China would have focused on achieving total self-sufficiency first, or on building economic ties primarily with other developing nations, wary of Western influence. This means the workshop of the world phenomenon, where China became the manufacturing hub for countless global brands, might never have happened, or at least not on the same scale. Your sneakers, your electronics, your furniture, they might be made in different countries altogether. Perhaps the tiger economies of Southeast Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong would have become even more dominant in manufacturing. Or maybe countries in Latin America or even parts of Africa, with different global trade winds blowing, would have seen their industrial sectors boom. The entire map of global supply chains and manufacturing centers we're familiar with would look profoundly different. Made in China might be a rare label reserved for specialist goods, rather than a ubiquitous stamp on everyday items. The economic rise of China would still have likely occurred eventually, but its timing, trajectory, and global impact would have been massively altered. Number 4. Vietnam could be a forgotten beach paradise, not a war story. President Kennedy was known to harbor deep skepticism about the deepening American involvement in Vietnam, even before our timeline's escalation. Had he survived and successfully negotiated an end to the Cold War, the entire rationale for a massive American military intervention in Southeast Asia would have crumbled. Vietnam was seen as a domino, a crucial battleground in the global struggle against communism. With that struggle de-escalated and a cooperative relationship building with the Soviet Union, which was a key backer of North Vietnam, the strategic imperative to save South Vietnam at all costs would have vanished. In this alternate reality, Kennedy, emboldened by his peace breakthrough with the Soviets, likely would have ordered a phased but decisive withdrawal of all American military advisors and personnel from Vietnam by 1965 or 1966. There would be no Gulf of Tonkin resolution, no massive troop deployments, no years of brutal jungle warfare, no Agent Orange, no My Lai. The Vietnam War, as the devastating conflict we know, simply wouldn't have happened on that scale. The internal Vietnamese conflict between North and South would likely have continued, but without massive external superpower involvement, it probably would have resolved itself much sooner, perhaps through a negotiated settlement brokered by a newly empowered UN or a swifter military victory for one side. Consequences for Vietnam itself, and for neighboring Laos and Cambodia, which were dragged into the maelstrom of our timeline's war, would be immense. Millions of lives saved. Landscapes unscarred by bombing and defoliants. Societies not traumatized by decades of unimaginable violence. By the 1970s and 80s, a unified Vietnam, whatever its political system, could have been focusing on development, agriculture, and perhaps, given its stunning coastline, emerging as a popular and peaceful tourist destination, a place known for its beaches and culture. The Vietnam sands that haunted American foreign policy for decades would never have existed. Instead of war memorials, there might be bustling resorts and international scientific marine reserves along its coast. Number 3. James Bond would have been super bored. Imagine a world where the suave super spy, James Bond, hands in his Walther PK, because there are no more global supervillains backed by rival superpowers. With Kennedy and the Soviets shaking hands and dismantling the Cold War apparatus in the mid-1960s, the shadowy world of espionage would have undergone a radical transformation. Organizations like the CIA and KGB, whose primary missions were to counter each other, would have seen their budgets slashed and their mandates shrink dramatically. What's the point of a massive spy network when your main adversary is now a partner in global peace initiatives? The thrilling narratives of nuclear brinkmanship, defecting scientists, and microfilm hidden in fountain pens would lose their urgency, their very reason for being spy thrillers. A dominant genre in film and literature would quickly become quaintly retro. Ian Fleming might have had to reinvent Bond as a corporate security consultant foiling hostile takeovers, or perhaps an agent for a new UN agency dedicated to, say, preventing the smuggling of endangered species. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. The whole genre of us versus them, with a cloak and dagger, would feel dated almost overnight. Pop culture would have reflected this new reality. Instead of spy movies, perhaps the big blockbusters of the 1970s and 80s would have been epic dramas about international teams of scientists collaborating to cure diseases or engineers building vast solar arrays in the desert. The heroes might have been diplomats, doctors, or explorers on joint US-Soviet expeditions to uncharted parts of the Amazon or the deep ocean. Action movies might have focused on daring disaster, relief missions, or the adventures of eco-warriors battling polluters. Complex moral ambiguities of the Cold War spy, often a troubled patriot doing dirty work for a greater good, would give way to clearer-cut narratives of cooperation or battles against more tangible, less ideological foes. Cultural landscape would be less about paranoia and suspicion, and more perhaps naively at times about shared human endeavor. Bond and his countless imitators would have simply been out of a job, or at best, relegated to a very quiet desk. Number 2. More countries got nukes, but they were like mini nukes. This one sounds counterintuitive, right? And the Cold War, less nukes? Not exactly. While the United States and the reformed Soviet entity, let's call it the Eurasian Commonwealth, would have engaged in massive bilateral nuclear disarmament, driven by the spirit of their peace accord and the sheer cost of maintaining huge arsenals, the global picture of proliferation would have become complicated. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, would still have been negotiated, perhaps even earlier, and with more initial signatories. However, the very diffusion of power that came with the end of the bipolar Cold War world would have had an ironic side effect, with the US and the Eurasian Commonwealth no longer projecting their superpower influence and their nuclear umbrellas as assertively into every corner of the globe. Regional powers started feeling a bit more antsy. Old rivalries, previously kept in check by the fear of superpower escalation, began to simmer. Nations that once relied on American or Soviet security guarantees felt the need to develop their own ultimate deterrent. So while Washington and Moscow were busy dismantling thousands of their city-busting behemoths, a slow but steady trickle of new, smaller nuclear players emerged through the 1970s and 80s. Think countries in volatile regions deciding they needed a few small, tactical nuclear weapons mini-nukes just to make their aggressive neighbors think twice. Technology was out there, and without the intense Cold War pressure to pick a side and abide by its non-proliferation rules, it became harder to contain. The nuclear club would have been larger, perhaps with a dozen or more members by the 1990s, instead of the handful in our timeline. However, and this is the crucial difference, these new nuclear arsenals would have been tiny compared to the Cold War stockpiles. No one was aiming for mutually assured destruction on a global scale. These were weapons of regional deterrence, a dangerous game of poker with much smaller entates. The overall global nuclear stockpile would be significantly lower, the risk of an all-out US-Soviet nuclear exchange gone. The world would be peppered with these smaller, localized nuclear tripwires, making regional diplomacy incredibly tense and complex. It was a shift from a single terrifying threat to a multitude of smaller, but still very real, dangers. Number 1. We could have been fighting climate change since the 70s and still messed it up. This is perhaps the most unexpected and deeply ironic consequence. With the Cold War machinery winding down in the late 1960s, a huge amount of scientific talent and resources previously dedicated to building better bombs or spy satellites was suddenly freed up. Joint US-Soviet scientific ventures, actively encouraged under the Kennedy-Kosygin peace, accords flourished. One of the first major collaborative efforts was in atmospheric and oceanic research. Early weather satellites, now sharing data openly, combined with coordinated ground and sea level measurements, began painting a much clearer and more alarming picture of what was happening to the planet's climate. By the early 1970s, the scientific consensus on anthropogenic global warming, CO2 from burning fossil fuels trapping heat, was already incredibly strong, backed by joint reports from American and Soviet academies of science. There was no debate manufactured by vested interests tied to Cold War ideologies. President Kennedy, in his fictional third term, having conquered the Cold War, declared a new war on global pollution in 1973, which quickly evolved into a global campaign against climate change as the data became undeniable. The first international climate summit with full US and Soviet backing was held in Geneva in 1978, not Rio in 1992. Ambitious targets for emissions reductions were set. Massive public and private investment poured into renewable energy research, solar, wind, geothermal, and even advanced, and hopefully safer, nuclear fission designs developed through international cooperation. Sounds like a utopian dream, right? We got a decades-long head start. But here's the kicker. Humanity, even with early warnings and a spirit of cooperation, still struggled. The sheer scale of transitioning the global economy away from fossil fuels was immense. Developing nations argued quite rightly that they shouldn't have to forego industrialization because the rich countries had already polluted their way to prosperity. Even in the reformed, more eco-conscious Eurasian Commonwealth, old coal mines and oil fields were hard to shut down. In the US, car culture and consumer habits were deeply entrenched. So, yes, significant progress was made. The worst-case scenarios of our timeline might have been avoided. But by the 1990s, in this alternate world, there was a growing sense of frustration. CO2 levels were still rising, albeit more slowly. The global climate accords of '78 were constantly being renegotiated and watered down. A different kind of eco-anxiety set in. The anxiety of knowing the problem intimately for decades, trying to fix it, and still finding it an almost insurmountable challenge. They were ahead of us, but they were still, in many ways, in the same slowly warming boat.